Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 3. I will give our attendees just a second to transition from the waiting room before we get started with this morning's session, the Healing Library. I can see the numbers going up. And thank you guys for joining us and hanging out with us for day 3. We are almost there. And today is a jam-packed day. We have several sessions today, lots of good information, lots of good content, and amazing speakers that you will meet today. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, I would love to take a second just to introduce myself. My name is Jamie Singletary, and I am the Senior Director of Clinical Brand and Community for Within Health. And I am joined by colleagues and friends this morning. My dear colleague and friend, Lori Brown, one of our dietitians at Within, who does many things with our clients and creates a loving and wonderful space for our clients here, and she will be moderating today's conversation. Before we get into the Healing Library, I do want to remind you all of just a few housekeeping notes. Want to be mindful that your CEO dashboard is going to be your best friend. It will be your schedule. It will give you an explanation of the sessions that are happening. You will also find your session evaluations there, along with video recordings of each session. As it pertains to our CE sessions, in order to receive credit, you will need to watch those live. If you are not getting credit for CEs, don't worry about it. But if you are, you will need to watch those sessions live and be there for a majority of the presentation to receive the credit. If you're having any technical issues, I will provide the CEO information. And if there are any questions just regarding the summit logistics, I will have my contact information there as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Lori for the Healing Library. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled to be here. I would like to start just with introducing our amazing group of authors. First, we have Tamie Gangloff. Tamie is a marriage and family therapist, national business development researcher, and adjunct professor at West Chester University, where she teaches eating disorder and psychology. She earned her master's in clinical psychology from Antioch University in Santa Barbara and brings extensive clinical experience, having worked across all levels of care for eating disorders and substance use. Tamie is the founding president of the Southwest Philadelphia IADEP chapter and serves as the medical trauma advisor for Root to Branch. She also is the author of Chronic Illness and Eating Disorders, Assessment, Clinical Skills, and Lived Experiences, where she combines research, her clinical expertise, and lived perspective to advance the field. Welcome, Tamie.
Thank you.
Next, we have Mallary Tenore Tarpley. Mallary is an assistant professor of Practice University of Texas at Austin, where she teaches journalism classes in the Moody College of Communication and writing classes at the Macomb School of Business. Her debut nonfiction book, Slip, Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery, explores the under-discussed complexities of eating disorders and recovery from them. The book is equal parts memoir and journalism, and it weaves together Mallary's own narrative with perspectives from clinicians, researchers, and others with lived experience. Mallary holds a bachelor's degree from Providence College and a master's of fine arts in nonfiction writing for Gosher College. She lives in the Austin area with her husband and 2 young children, Madeline and Tucker. So nice to see you this morning, Mallary. Next, we have Johanna Kulp. Johanna is the founder and owner of Live Well Therapy Associates, an outpatient group practice that's specializing in the treatment of eating disorders. She has over 2 decades of clinical expertise supporting individuals in recovery and is trained in cognitive behavioral therapy, trauma-focused therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Her clinical approach is informed by the principles of health at every size. In addition to her clinical leadership, she's an author and speaker. Her recent publication, Peace with Your Body, a body image guide for women, reflects her commitment to advancing body image resilience and recovery. Drawing from both her professional expertise and personal recovery experience, she brings a unique perspective to her work in the broader field of treatment. So nice to have you as well, Johanna.
Thank you.
Well, I thought what I would love to start with in this conversation is just the art of storytelling itself. And I would love to hear from all of you your version of how the story started and propelled you into writing a book. Can you just speak to what that was like? And I would love to start with you, Tammy.
Oh my gosh, okay. We'll have to repeat the question. So how this came about was kind of a journey that I really feel like I fell into. It was my own lived experience being recovered for a long time and then living in a body with chronic medical conditions for most of my life. And through different surgeries and things that I experienced really just over the last 7 years, my wheels got turning as far as how I experienced surgery when I was still in a disordered body versus a recovered body, and all of the things that go along with it, relationships and everything else. So I presented at Renewed a couple years ago, and I always say this, Tammy Beasley raised her hand and said, "When are you going to write a book?" And I said, "Well, I guess I'll turn this into a book proposal." And here we are. It's actually just been in the world like about a month and a half now, which is a really surreal experience. But obviously, a lot more happened in between. But it really just was my wanting people to understand and know that there's somebody else out there that really gets it. So, yeah, Johanna, I'll go to you next.
Um, I love this question because my immediate thought goes to the storytelling that I took in from others while I was working on my own personal recovery. And so I came about wanting to write my book because I was sitting with people in my clinical practice that were saying, like, I wish I had a book that took together, like, combined together clinical stuff that I'm learning here, but also like somebody else's story and how they used that together, like with their work, their own personal clinical work, and their own story. And it came together for them and how they worked through their own body image issues. And as I was sitting with my clients, I was thinking back to the stories that I had read from authors like, not, who aren't clinicians, but just like Anne Lamott when she was talking about like her own body image issues and how she was working through that herself. And I thought about the impact that those had had on me when I was working on my recovery. And so I wanted to be able to write a book that took like my story and combined it with like, parts of the work that of like my own clinical orientation and gave that story to other people to use with like their own sort of process, right? To take what they wanted from that and use it for motivation moving forward. So I think storytelling is like, and I think having others that tell their stories and having my own story that I can share, I think that's like some of the most important thing that we can give for recovery work in the future.
So, yeah, I mean, I've always wanted to write a book. I've always identified as a writer. I'm not a clinician, so I'm a journalist by trade. And I started writing iterations of my memoir when I was 17 years old. The book really looks at how I developed anorexia after losing my mom to metastatic breast cancer when I was 11, and looks at my diagnosis and my treatment and my ongoing recovery, and really weaves together a lot of reporting and research as well. But as I would write different iterations of this book over the years, I always thought that I had to be fully recovered before I got it published. And that day hasn't arrived, right? I am far better than I ever imagined I would be, but I am not fully recovered from the disorder. And so it occurred to me about 5 years ago, when I was really working on this latest iteration of the book, that maybe I could write this from the perspective of someone who is in what I call the middle place, which is this name I've given to this liminal space between acute sickness and full recovery. And what does it mean to be in this space with the belief that recovery is possible, but messy and imperfect? And so I started to kind of explore these questions around what does it mean to be better, but not all better? And what does it mean to live with the imprints of your disorder, knowing that it remains a vulnerability? And I had not seen any books written about this. And I felt like there was this lack of a mirrored image whenever I would read books on eating disorders and recovery. And so I really wanted to create a space that would enable people who are in this middle place to feel more seen and heard. And I wanted to really try to remove some of the stigma and shame that come with the slips that we often have in the recovery process. So this is the book that I wish that I had when I was acutely sick and when I was in the early stages of my recovery. And it's also the book that I still feel that I need and want. And I hope that I can encourage more conversations around this middle place, which I don't see as quasi or pseudo recovery, but really as a place where many of us live as we continue to move forward in our recovery.
Mm. That reminds me so much, just this idea of like stories at large truly being a tool of healing. And I think there's so much vulnerability when it's our personal story. And I'm curious, you kind of named this, Mallory, but I'm curious if there are parts that felt really challenging of like translating your experience and insights into a book or like putting it into words. I'm curious what that was like.
Yeah, it was a very vulnerable experience, right? And I think that all writers and especially memoirists have just this feeling of exposure when they're writing, right? Because it is this emotional state of exposure that we have to navigate, especially when figuring out what to reveal and what to conceal.
Mm,
For me, and Tammy and Joanna may have experienced this too. I mean, when you're kind of writing these personal narratives, it's really an exercise in excavating the past. And so I had to look through all of these old medical records. I had
mm,
to comb through all of my old journals, which I meticulously kept when I was in treatment. And that felt like this emotional Mount Everest trying to read through those. I did a lot of revisitation. So I went back to the places where I was treated, and I met with former medical providers who had treated me. So all of this was quite difficult, but I made a very conscious decision to go back to therapy when I started writing this book because I often think that writing can be therapeutic, but it's not therapy. And so I needed to be able to make sure that I was working through things off the page before I was actually putting them on the page in the manuscript. And that is spoken from someone who's been in recovery for 20 plus years, right? So I've had a lot of distance. It's not as though I was writing about something that just happened. But even so, sort of all of that emotional investment in terms of really re-inhabiting my younger self, putting that on the page, required vulnerability, but certainly required a willingness to also make sure that I was taking care of myself in that process as well.
yeah. Something else that I would love to hear from all of you, because when you were all speaking on that initial question, I think everyone spoke to kind of wanting their piece to have, this evidence, but also lived experience. And I would love for each of you just to highlight, as authors, as clinicians, as a professor, how do you balance evidence-based practice and research with the narrative and creative aspect of your own story? Tammy.
For me also as being a professor, I love I'm not a researcher, but I love reading research. And so as I was, the writing of my story piece was also really hard and emotional, but then I was able to dive into the other topics. I would kind of do some journal writing and then get an idea and then have to dive into research. There isn't a lot of research on my topic. And so I kind of just was combing through and trying to find something that like worked, or ordering the new book and reading the new book on the topic that fit, and also finding other people's lived experiences. So there's my lived experience kind of in the beginning and throughout the book, and also the lived experience of 5 other people, because similar to Johanna, it was really hearing other people's stories that helped me in my recovery and early recovery. And so mine is not the only voice in, the chronic illness eating disorder space. So I wanted to include others and also kind of bits and pieces of the clinical as well. And I also found what worked for me in my recovery, and found kind of more research on that. So it was a hard journey of finding all the pieces to fit together, because there just isn't enough out there. And hopefully we'll keep talking more about these things as well.
Yeah. What do you think, Mallory?
So I initially had conceived of my book as being a literary memoir where I thought it would mostly focus on my own story. But the more I delved into it, the more I recognized that I fit the stereotypical mold of someone with an eating disorder in many ways. And I didn't want this to just be my story alone. And so I ended up just using these journalistic skills to really do a lot of interviews. I ended up surveying over 700 people with lived experience with an eating disorder, and interviewed 175 of those survey respondents and clinicians and researchers, and really tried to weave in all these other personal narratives with the latest research on eating disorders and insights from clinicians. Because naively, I thought I was an expert on eating disorders, just based on my lived experience. But then I realized that there was so much that I didn't know and so much that I learned during that reporting process. And I think that made the book ultimately richer, just because I was able to really sort of weave those things together, and think about the ways in which there's so much amazing research out there, but a lot of times it doesn't necessarily get in front of the right people. And so I saw it as this real great responsibility as a journalist to be able to take some of that research and write about it in a very accessible way, and help people to make connections perhaps between their own lived experience and the research that may help them to understand more about their own illness or their recovery. There were so many aha moments that I had when I would be interviewing clinicians or researchers and thinking, oh, it makes sense as to why I was so stuck in these cognitive ruts in the late 90s when I was acutely sick, right? I didn't know that there were all these neurobiological changes happening. So yeah, I mean, it made for a much more complicated undertaking in terms of trying to kind of write this book, but I hope ultimately it made it better to bring in kind of the research and clinical insights from practitioners.
Johanna, what's it been like for you, this idea of like evidence-based and story weaving?
Yeah. So I'll echo what Tamie said, not a researcher. No, that's, I mean, a clinician, right? But I love reading the research, but I'm not a person that does the research. But just to echo also what Mallary said, for me, writing this book was sort of a lot of aha moments for myself as a clinician, for like why a certain modality or why a certain technique can be used to help someone, even for myself in my own recovery process, to work through some really negative patterns with body image, right? Some really negative patterns of relating to oneself. And then how like the research actually informs the clinical work and then informs like the actual breakthroughs and the actual like points of freedom for oneself with body image work. So I know I sit with clients, day in and day out, and I talk about, a certain way that we can work through healing with trauma, right? And how that might actually help with body image issues, right? How those two things pair together. But then sitting with my book and getting further and further into the research of why and how like working through this particular trauma memory is going to actually impact this particular experience in one's body, and really being able to put together with like the clinical like background to that in a book based for other people. I mean, it brought a lot of movement for me as myself, like, and how I can actually then go back to my work and give that even more to clients. Like, so I know that we're talking about doing this particular intervention. Here's why it's actually going to produce some freedom, right? Here's why we're going to actually find a little bit more hope, a little bit more movement for you. You can get to a point of tolerating this particular part of your body. You can get to a point of actually feeling neutral with it. And then we can use that to move forward to actually feeling some positive stuff with it, and giving them like a little bit of a background for how that can happen. So it was, I think even as a clinician that's using a lot of the evidence-based like modalities in my work, it was still aha moments for me of how that clicks together to actually like help somebody feel, ultimately better in the long term.
Yeah, I'm curious, Johanna, when you are, sitting with your clients and have that like clinician hat on, do you find yourself leaning into storytelling in your sessions?
1,000%.
Yeah.
And I like, even with when I'm doing talks about my book, I always like put an asterisk there, and I'll say storytelling when it feels appropriate for the client, right? Because I've referenced a couple of different times my own process, right? So when I'm sitting with somebody, if I'm sitting with them and they're in a moment where it's essentially why I wrote my book, where they just feel hopeless, right? Where they just feel like, oh my gosh, I don't think that I'm ever going to like my thighs. I don't think I'm ever going to like my stomach. I don't think I'm ever going to feel any peace here. If my story or any parts of somebody else's story is going to be helpful, I love to be able to bring that in and sort of talk about like the movement of like, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, how something might have felt, and then how it actually can change and move forward, right? I think there's just so much power in it if it's going to be helpful, right? So as a clinician, you're always, I'm always checking myself and making sure that what I'm sharing is actually going to be useful to the person in front of me. But if it can be, yeah, 1,000%.
I love that. Tamie, I would like leave, it could be the same question, I suppose. Like, do you find yourself telling stories or just at large? What role do you believe storytelling can play?
In recovery. I think the storytelling is really important. To Johanna's point, of course, when it's clinically appropriate, I find that the storytelling through this has really been an amazing way also to connect with other clinicians. There's a lot of clinicians that didn't realize, like, oh, I also have a chronic illness, and I also live with have these same feelings. Mallary, I can really relate to what you had said, because I feel like a lot of what I talk about in the resilience is about being like kind of living life in the middle. Like, I'm not waiting for my life to start when I'm not in pain. I'm trying to find resilience and quality of life in the presence of pain. And so having those conversations, I can easily relate that to a client without getting into kind of the details of my story. And then those of you that know me really well, Johanna, Jamie, like I will share those details, because I think it's important to have spaces where we can connect with each other as clinicians also and share our stories, because that impacts how we work with our clients every single day.
Mm,
Yeah.
I love that. It's like this idea of storytelling, offering hope, and also just connecting us as humans.
Yeah. It's actually, just to cut in for a second, I think it's why I wrote my book, and I think it's why it's so powerful to be sitting here with the other authors, and and you guys have been, I think, doing a lot of this throughout the whole conference. It's bringing like that element of like of power in somebody's lone lived experience, and power in terms of like being vulnerable about that lived experience, being honest about that lived experience, right? I mean, I know that a lot of times, like, having sitting with somebody and having them know that, the person sitting in front of them understands that pain that they've gone through, right? Like, I think there's something so powerful with that.
Mm. I'm curious because what I'm hearing is like there's a labor when you write a book. I have not gone on that journey, but there's like this emotional labor that you have put into authoring your books. And I guess I'm wondering if you have found that that process of writing has like influenced how you show up, whether it's as a clinician, whether it's maybe in a relational role in your community. I'm just curious how the process of writing maybe is showing up for you.
And I think a lot about just authentic storytelling, because I think about how, for the longest time after I left treatment, I told everyone I was fully recovered. And even once I had relapsed, I continued to tell people I was fully recovered because I was ashamed to admit that I wasn't. And so there was this great disconnect between the narrative that I was sharing with the world and the one that I was actually living out behind closed doors. And I often say that this book, which just came out a month and a half ago, I mean, it's still newly released, but already I'm feeling like it is opening up other avenues for people to share their stories. I've heard from readers who have said, this is giving me language to be able to describe my own story. And I think a lot of that comes down to just the honesty that it took to write this story, because I think that I'm recognizing now that it is an act of courage in many ways to write a book about not having overcome something, right? And to sort of write a book that is about still living in the middle of something. And I think that that's especially true in a society that tends to prefer narratives with protagonists who prevail and who triumph. But for me, it's been really important to think about, how do I authentically capture my own narrative and where I'm at, and do so from a place of very realistic hope, right? And so I think that writing this book has encouraged me to just be really honest about where I'm at in general. And it's sparked a lot more sort of authentic storytelling for me, not only as a writer, but just as a person. And it's encouraged me to be even more open about moments when maybe I slip, right? And thinking about how did I slip? Why did I slip? And how did I get back up again? So my hope is that it encourages other people to also feel comfortable enough to speak truth to where they're at in their recovery, be it the middle place or somewhere else.
I think you're just essentially saying like it's breaking the shame, right? That sometimes can hold people back, right? Whatever that might be, and giving language to an experience that of course someone else is having, right? If we're having it, somebody else is having it. So if we can be vessels to break that shame and allow people to allow others to break that shame pattern for themselves too. I mean, that's what we're working towards here.
Definitely.
Yeah, I would second all of that. I think it's allowed me to show up more authentically because I can't hide anymore. Like it's one thing when you're presenting at conferences, and another thing when I'm like when somebody can like hold it and like then reflect something back to you in your story that you're like, oh God, I forgot that was in there. Yikes. That's a little scary sometimes, but then just to be able to be more authentic, and then hopefully that allows like other people to do that too. I always say, like, smile and look pretty for the pictures. And then I can really say to people, like, this is what that means to me. Somebody came up to me after a talk a couple weeks ago and said, how are you physically feeling? I didn't know you felt that way all the time. And I smiled and I was like, I'm hurting right now. Like I can say that instead of just going home and being in pain, to just say like, I'm hurting right now and I'm also still showing up. And I hope that gives you the space to show up and also say how you're actually feeling, because it's really hard to do. It's really vulnerable. So I hope it gives people space to do that.
Yeah. I think that you've all already kind of spoken to this, but I'd love to give you a moment to see if there's any other thoughts or maybe speaking a little bit more deeper on this topic of shame and stigma. So, do you have a hope maybe for your book that would contribute to changing or challenging the narratives around mental health and eating disorders?
Mm. So one thing that I persevered to write about in Finding Peace with Your Body is that specifically when you are working on recovery, and even when you are recovered from an eating disorder, there are just going to be days where you may not feel at peace with your body. And I know it might sound in contradiction to the title, which is Finding Peace with Your Body, but I wanted to break sort of like through, Mallary, it's a lot of what you're talking about too, that sort of ideology, or that sort of like all or nothing sort of thinking around like, I'm gonna move to recovery, and then I'm just gonna feel like fantastic about my body. And then, if there are days that you're falling short of that, because we're human beings, we might struggle with, like a day where we feel a little bit more off, or maybe we're more stressed, or maybe there's just something going on in our life where we're not going to feel 100% at peace with ourselves, right? At peace with our body image or our recovery. That like, I didn't want somebody to feel like, okay, then they've fallen short, or okay, then they're not there yet. Okay, then they still have like, mountains of work ahead of them. I wanted the healing to be that, even on those days that maybe you're feeling a little bit more uncomfortable with your body, or maybe not at 100% with it, that like there are still opportunities for you to still connect to your body, for you to still give a lot of grace for yourself. And I wanted to be able to give a language for breaking through that, right? That we can find peace with our bodies, and it doesn't have to be some almost unattainable like place of that, right? That it can actually have some nuances to it.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback off of that. Johanna and I actually quoted each other in each other's books, because it was really, your work is really one of the first that I've read, or maybe the first that I've read that actually includes disabled bodies in the conversation about body image, and breaking the stigma about that. It's, I believe that a lot of times in eating disorder treatment and recovery, it's kind of like an afterthought. And so it's then like hidden, like I shouldn't really talk about this thing over here, and how my body doesn't work the way it's supposed to. And even though I'm in recovery or recovered, where everyone is on that spectrum, that my body doesn't always feel like my friend. And so when we're like embodiment, yay, I feel great, I love my body and everything it can do, that's not the reality for a lot of people. And even recovered some days it's my reality and some days it's not. So I like that kind of breaking the stigma that it's okay just to be a person in a body, and some days it's okay and I feel great, and some days not so much. So, and that making that normal and keeping that neutral, and that's okay.
Relate to so much of what both of you just said. And I think, stigma and shame is something I thought a lot about just as I was writing Slip. And it's largely why I titled the book that, right? I remember at one point, there was someone I was interviewing for the book, and she had said, well, I wouldn't title your book Slip because that word has a really negative connotation in the eating disorder field. And I thought, well, that's precisely the point, right? I want to remove that stigma and shame, because I think about how when I initially left treatment after many, many years of treatment, I thought, okay, if I make one wrong move, I'm going to slide back into dangerous territory and get sick again. And I didn't
Mm.
believe there was a space in between, nor did I think I was allowed to slip. And so I think a lot of times people who find themselves in the middle place do feel stigma and shame, and often remain silent because they think I shouldn't be in this space, or I shouldn't be in this space for any extended period of time. A lot of times, as I mentioned too, we hear this space sometimes referred to as quasi or pseudo recovery, and that's not really what the middle place is about, right? It's rooted in really trying to move forward in your recovery. But I think that sometimes the language that we use to describe different points in the recovery process, like pseudo and quasi recovery, can be a bit pernicious because they can make people feel like they're faking their recovery or that it's somehow not real. And that can keep people silent, right, about their slips. I know for the longest time I was silent about them, and that silence really kept me stuck and sick. And so a lot of this book for me is wanting to just remove the stigma and shame that accompany slips in the recovery process, so that people can feel more empowered to say, okay, I'm in this middle place. I have slipped. How do I figure out who to tell, and how do I work on getting back up now? Not, a month from now once I'm done with my deadlines, not 6 months from now. How do I get back up now so that these slips don't accumulate and turn into lapses and relapses? So that was a big part of it, was just kind of trying to destigmatize some of these words, or lack thereof, that we have for describing recovery.
Yeah. I just happened to notice that someone in the chat was kind of echoing how the power of words are important when we're talking about recovering. I was just like, even kind of sitting here with a little bit of humbleness, or just a bit of a somber spirit, because I do sit with people every day, and just thinking about how language and representation is truly so important. And we're just always learning, just always learning. So I appreciate you just showing up and giving me some things, and those of us that are listening, just giving us some things to think about. This is going to be kind of a hard question. Like, as a human, whenever people ask me, like, if you could do one, I'm like, I don't know. So we'll try not to make it pressure, but like, if you could pick like a takeaway or a hope that you have, if someone reads this book, what's one thing that you're hoping that they'll take with them?
I'll start. So for me, it always is the ends up being with the resilience piece of it. I think I said something similar earlier, but really just that we can have a life in the midst of pain. It's complicated because then I'm also going on my doctor's appointments to try to reduce that pain. But just that resilience, the resilience doesn't mean you failed. It just means that, like, I can keep moving forward and have a
Mm.
good life in the presence of pain. Like, that's the goal of, I think that's the goal, period, right? Because but the goal is really that we can have that quality of life in the presence of pain, and then of course have the support and learning how to do that. And that applies obviously not just to the disability or the eating disorder, but really kind of the intersection of them together.
Mhm. Yeah, Tammy, I have kind of a personal question that popped in my brain. That intersection that you just spoke of, like, for you in your own story, do you feel like it was something that you kind of immediately were aware of, or has it just been over time that you've recognized like that overlap or intersection between chronic illness and eating disorder?
I always had said that, I talk about the beginning of the book, that my being diagnosed with scoliosis, hearing the word deformity, and then
Mm.
wearing a back brace was part of many things, kind of the perfect storm that created my eating disorder. But I didn't really get the full extent of it until I had, multiple surgeries, and then a new diagnosis of something else and a setback. And, how even in a surgery I had a couple years ago, how it impacted my eating, because, I didn't feel well and I was nauseous and my stomach hurt. And I was like, oh my gosh, if this was, X number of years ago and I was still struggling, this would have been a really, really hard time. Like, we have dietitian friends. I called someone, I was like, what should I do? I can't use my limbs right now to eat. But I had that support. So I was like, wow, this would have been so hard if I was still in a disordered eating body. And so that's what kind of really made me kind of pushed me forward as far as like, I have to talk about this. Before it was just like, okay, this is a part of my story, but now it's a part of my story that needs to have a voice.
Yeah, it really does. Thank you again, just so much, because I've found myself, I'm present in the conversation, but just thinking about how if we're not careful, we can sort of paint this picture of recovery as like a flower field, and not speaking down to the power of recovery and a life worth living. But what I'm really hearing today is that for many of us, it's a journey and a process. And even in recovery, we might have slips, or even in recovery, we might have pain. And that's a really valuable story as well. It's not like one story to recovery. Um, since we're speaking about stories and resources and books, oh, wait, I didn't get to hear from everybody. One thing that one thing that you wanted, that you were hoping. So, Mallary, what are you hoping if someone reads your book, that they would take away from it?
Sure. Well, just to piggyback off of what you and Tammy were just talking about, I mean, one thing that comes to mind is this phrase, don't let the slip stop you. That's something I think a lot about, but also this idea of really trying to embrace gray spaces and also grace spaces. So often the language that we use to describe sickness and recovery does tend to be very black and white, where you're acutely sick or you're fully recovered. And for me, it's been super important to think about how do we embrace these gray spaces in recovery, these liminal spaces. And in talking with so many other people, they've said that they want to be having more conversations about these gray spaces and feeling like they can. And one of the beauties of talking about these gray spaces is that we can begin to look at slips, for instance, not as grounds for failure, but as opportunities for growth. And so we can think about how do we, within these gray spaces, give ourselves grace when we slip rather than shaming ourselves. And so that's really important. And the more we can speak truth to this place rather than stigmatizing it, the more we can encourage really honest and authentic storytelling. So I hope people will come away with that sentiment after reading the book.
I love that. Grace and gray, embracing those. Fantastic.
I would just echo what everybody said. I feel like that's the common theme of this session. And so my thing would say it would be like finding peace with your body is possible. And it may not look as like perfect, quote unquote, as you initially thought when you embarked on body image recovery work. And it definitely will look messy. But the key thing that we're working on is just reestablishing that relationship, right, of listening to your body and taking care of it and whatever that might look like day in and day out. So again, it's just it fits what Mallary and Tammy already said, right? Like we allow for that that gray space. We allow for that middle road in a lot of this work.
It's always such a unique moment and kind of a bonding moment when like a theme emerges and you don't plan on it. But I have heard these themes today. I think it could be really helpful for those that are listening just to essentially be able to pick your brain about stories and books that you would recommend. So I guess the question is if you could recommend books to us that are listening that have been influential and shaped your own perspective, who would be the authors, or what are the books that you would recommend to us, and maybe why?
Two books come to mind. One is called The Invisible Kingdom by Megan O'Rourke. It's a really beautiful book that looks at Megan's struggles with autoimmune disorders and really talks about how invisible those can be, particularly if you're trying to seek treatment and can't get it or can't figure out exactly what's wrong. And she does a lot of this blending of personal narrative and reporting that she's done. And then the other one is Between Two Kingdoms by Suleika Jawad, which looks at what it means to have had cancer and to know that it is not gone, right? And that you are living with the imprints of this disease. And you'll notice both of those titles have the word kingdom in them, and they are a nod to Susan Sontag's seminal work, Illness as Metaphor. And Susan talks about this idea that we all inhabit the kingdom of the well, as she said, and the kingdom of the sick. And at some point in time, we have to traverse in the space in between. And often the boundaries between the kingdom of the well and the kingdom of the sick are quite porous. And so I'm really interested in authors who explore kind of those middle grounds and spaces, of course. And I feel like those two writers in particular do a really beautiful job of that.
Thank you, Mallory. I want to acknowledge I didn't get the first title. Would you say that again?
Sure. It's The Invisible Kingdom by Megan O'Rourke, and then Between Two Kingdoms by Suleika Jawad. And I can put them in the chat too.
Thank you. Someone I just happened to notice in the chat was like, please expand my book list. And I'm like, oh yeah, I want to write these down myself. So thank you so much. What do you have, Tamie? Any thoughts?
I was busy writing those down because I have not read them yet, and all that conversation is really important to me. I thought of the very first book that I'm sure most of you know about, but the very first book to me that was impactful many years ago was Eating in the Light of the Moon. And so if you haven't read that, please read that. I think the metaphor and storytelling really helped me in early recovery, and I think it applies to actually all of life. So when I used to do a lot of groups, I would include a lot of times pieces from that work. And then the next one has nothing to do with eating disorder recovery at all, but it was written by somebody who lost their vision overseas in the military and then became this Paralympic triathlete. And it's called Fire in My Eyes by Brad Snyder. And his work and talking about resilience really impacted me in my recovery from some pretty major surgeries. I'm like, okay. And I kind of, no pun intended, like consumed books just like that to kind of inspire, and also like, okay, if this person did this thing, maybe I can recover from this thing too. So.
So I would say it's a popular book, so potentially you all have read it, but I still need to give credit where credit is due. The Body is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor, made me cry, made me feel hopeful, made me feel all the things, and was a huge inspiration for me wanting to write a book that, talked about body image. Just the idea of not having to apologize for any parts of your body, not having to, to kowtow to any shame, right? Whether that's like internalized or societal or both, right? But to being able to be like authentic and show up in your body as it is, that moved me in a way that I feel like is really powerful and actually goes with the theme of a lot of the things we're talking about today. So yeah, I quoted a lot in my book, and I loved it, and it was I think it's pretty seminal in the work of body image work.
Thank you. I wonder in our last bit of time that we have together, if we kind of do some future casting, I think it's called, like looking ahead. What stories or themes do you feel still need to be told within the eating disorder / mental health field?
Thing I've been thinking a lot about is just the chapter I have in my book about pregnancy and the postpartum phase, because I write about just my own experiences of having really encountered a lot of slippage, if you will, postpartum after having my two kids. And most of this related to obsessive pumping, where I had struggled with obsessive compulsive disorder when I was acutely sick years ago, and then had this real flare up where I became quite obsessive around pumping breast milk, partly as a form of burning calories. And I remember I had never written about this before, outside of having written essays about donating 10 gallons of breast milk, right? I wrote essays about that, but I didn't write about what was actually happening, underneath the surface. And it wasn't until I wrote the book that I was really honest about that. But I started to talk with clinicians and researchers, and I attended lots of eating disorder conferences, including panels on pregnancy, but this was not discussed. And I thought, it seems like this is really an issue. And I talked with two researchers who are looking into it, and they talked about how oftentimes it feels like a taboo subject to discuss, partly because of the whole idea that breast is best. And so they were trying to do research on this, looking into kind of the intersections between postpartum and OCD and eating disorders. But there's so little research on this and so few discussions about it. And when I was interviewing people, some of them would say, yes, I struggled with that. And then since publishing the book, the feedback that I've gotten the most has actually been from middle-aged women who have said, I struggled very much with obsessive pumping, but it was a very secretive behavior. I felt ashamed of it, and nobody's talking about it, right? And this sort of refrain of, I thought I was the only one, keeps popping up. And I mention that because I think it's something that we need to be talking about more. And especially as we think about preparing people for life transitions, be it pregnancy or menopause or just big cross-country moves, right? Whatever those transitions might be, we have to be thinking about how do we help people with eating disorders to recognize potential triggers. And so that for me has been one that I feel is under discussed and warrants more exploration.
Yeah, I am really glad that you named that. I'm reminded of a story in my own clinical work, probably like 7 years ago, of working with someone who had a similar experience, and me wanting to try and like find something. There was nothing. There's like literally not a resource or support group that spoke to that I could offer to that client. So I'm really glad that you're just shedding some light and talking about that more.
Yeah.
I would.
I want to, oh,
Okay.
yeah, Jen.
No, you go.
Okay. Sorry. I said I wanted to piggyback on that too, because as I'm in the latter transition, right, at my age, and I that the menopause, that kind of 50 something age range, but then also just the women's GYN health in general, because it's something that's not talked about until you have to talk about it. I'll say this, as everyone, my close friends know this, I've seen 5 different doctors this year to finally get a diagnosis, to finally have a surgery coming up. And so it was then like started asking people questions and like, oh yeah, when this happened to me, I'm like, why are we not talking about this? Because it greatly impacts definitely your body image, your relationships, all of the things. And so I think that that's such an important topic that just is completely missed. And I feel like there's some shame there that doesn't need to be there. Like we should be able to talk about our bodies in that way. And then the other piece of it that ties in for me is the functional appreciation of our bodies and how our function impacts our body image. So I feel like they're all kind of tied together.
Tammy, I love it because you said what I was going to say, which is great
Oh
because
no.
no, it's perfect. It's perfect. I was going to say I think we need more stories related to like aging and taking care of an aging body, eating disorder recovery wise. But I'll also add, I think we just need more stories. I think from, different people in the community, I think stories like from recovery work, from somebody that's in the BIPOC community is important. I think stories from somebody that's in the LGBTQ community is important now more than ever, right? I think a story from, a male, a cis male that is recovering from an eating disorder is important. I think anybody that has a story to share will be really important right now, because I think we need that. I think people need to be able to see themselves in somebody else's writing in order to give and instill some hope, right? Like that somebody gets where you are and can see where they can go from there. So I mean, I think that there are some niche topics to be covered, and absolutely, and I think we need all of that.
Yeah. What would you say to people that maybe are like, yes, I hear you and I don't want to author a book? Any last minute thoughts about like how we can share story in other forms?
I mean, Substack is great. I don't know if you were looking for that answer or not, but I love like when I can connect with somebody, and even just, you don't have to write a whole book, right? But if you just want to share yourself a little bit, like in terms of like a blog, or yeah, I think that there's small ways to be able to like get your work, your life, your vision, your tools out there to others. That I am not sponsored by Substack. That was not a push for Substack. But I mean, I just think it doesn't have to be a book is a lot. It doesn't have to be a book, right? It can be something even smaller than that. Or just share with the people around you, right? Just share.
Yeah.
Share that, be vocal.
Yeah, I need to get on Substack. It's on my list of things to do. Even a podcast, there are a lot of great podcasts out there. So having that space to just be on, ask somebody, can I be on your podcast? I have a story to tell, and it's really a nice, like, conversational way to tell your story. I like that.
I think sometimes writing prompts too can be incredibly helpful. And I have, yeah, just writing prompts for kind of that are specific to eating disorders and recovery, and then just general writing prompts. But one thing I've been thinking a lot about lately is the Japanese art of kintsugi, which I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, but it's this idea of sort of these pieces of broken pottery that are mended with lacquer and powdered golds. And so rather than trying to treat the breaks and flaws and concealing them, you sort of are looking at them and mending them. And so a lot of times, just when I'm doing writing exercises with students or even professionals, I'll ask attendees to imagine that they are interviewing their most authentic self. And then I'll ask, what is a crack in your life that you've kept hidden and want to reveal in your writing? Why have you kept it hidden? And how might the revelation help you to express a truer, more authentic self on the page? And so I think that that's can be really beautiful when we think about what are these cracks that maybe we've kept hidden and why, and what might it mean to expose them, right? And we may not be ready to expose them in a public way, and that's okay, but maybe we can feel safe at least exposing them in the pages of journals or in a therapy session. So even doing some writing exercises like that can crack open some really revelatory things.
Wow.
We are at time, so I'm going to hand it back over to Jamie to kind of wrap things up. But thank you again, everyone, for just sharing parts of your story.
This has been absolutely amazing. You all are receiving so much love in the chat, and I am so grateful for you all and the work you've done and just what you've contributed to the field. And before we wrap, I would just love for each of you to share where we can find your books and how to support you. And I'll go with Joanna. You'll start first.
Yeah, hi. So you can find me, I think probably one of the biggest places that I'm on is Instagram. So it's johannakulp.lcsw. My book can be found on my website, which is also johannakulp.lcsw. And also bookshop.org has it as well.
Okay, Tamie, where can we find you?
Same. My website is just my name, TamieGangloff.com, and also on Instagram, it's at author Tamie Gangloff. And then my book is you can get on, I think, bookshop.org, also on Amazon and Barnes and Noble as well.
And Mallary?
Yeah, I am on Substack. It's just Mallary, Mallary.substack.com, and just offer up best practices and writing tips on a weekly basis. And then I'm on Instagram. It's just my full name, Mallary Tenore Tarpley. And you can find my book on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, your local independent bookstore. And yeah, I hope you'll check it out.
Well, thank you all so much. This has been a wonderful kickoff to day 3. For those of you in the chat, we appreciate your comments and your love. And we will take a brief break and then we will reconvene at 11 o'clock for our first CE session of the day with my good friend Michelle Felton and Kat. So we will see you all in just a few moments. Thank you. Bye.